Hey guys, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Did You Know with Driven. Did You Know will be a series of videos where I talk about some perhaps not so common knowledge about issues, things in the auto industry, about leasing, about financing a car, things that you've probably in the past had questions about, things that you perhaps wanted answers for or wanted some clarification for. On this episode, I will talk a bit about leasing and getting out of a lease. So let's get right into it. Did you know that just because you are in a lease, that doesn't mean that you are stuck in that lease until the end of the term? Just like a car that you're financing, a car that you own right out, you can trade that car in. So you can trade a lease in, right? Now, every lease, every contract may be a little different. So just because you can get out of a lease, that does not mean that you can do so without some kind of penalty, right? There won't always be a penalty, but there might be. It depends on the lease term, the lease contract, and the conditions of that contract. So just like a car that you are financing that has a payoff, a lease also has a payoff. A lease actually has, there's two kinds of payoffs that a lease may have. One will be just, the remaining payments left on a lease to close out that contract. So if you're on a 3-year lease and you are 2 years into the lease, you've made 2 years worth of payments. That means you have 1 year left of payments. So 12 payments of however much your monthly payment is, and you close out that lease, right? So that is one way to get out of a lease. That is one payoff. Another payoff is just a more general payoff. And this is what would be used to buy out the car essentially. So if you were considering buying out that lease and keeping that car, that would be the other payoff. Now this payoff can also be used to get out of a lease, right? So let's say 2 years into the lease, you feel like you want to get out, you want a new car, you take that car, you get it appraised just like a trade-in, and they give you a value for the car. You then compare that value to the payoff and see what works out best. If you got lucky and the car has low mileage, is in great condition, you may have equity in the car, right? So what equity means is you have a car that is worth more than what the payoff is. So let's say your car comes in at a trade-in value of $25,000. You only owe $22,000. That means you have $3,000 in equity. That equity you can use to make a down payment on a new car. So if you were trading that car in, you're trading that lease in, you're trading in a car that has $3,000 in value, in equity. That $3,000 now becomes your down payment. Same thing as a finance. This is actually the exact same scenario you would use when trading in a car that you're financing, if you have equity. If you don't have equity and you're negative in the car, then whatever negative equity you have, you can roll into the next lease or purchase that you buy. So two kinds of payoffs, the remaining payments and then the payoff to buy out the car. Sometimes paying off the car completely will be more beneficial because the difference between the value of the car and the payoff will be less than if you were to make the remaining payments. So let's say your payment is $500, you have a year left, and that makes $6,000, right? 5 times 12 is 60. Add a zero, that's $6,000 that you would have in remaining payments, right? So you're rolling in $6,000. Now let's say you appraise the car, just like the scenario that I showed or that I talked about. where you have $3,000 in equity, or let's say negative equity, right? So let's say you have $3,000 in negative equity per the appraisal of the car. So at that point, you have two choices. You can trade the car in and roll in $3,000 of negative equity, or you can choose to make $6,000 in payments. The smartest decision would be to make or trade in the car at the $3,000 negative equity, right? You get out of the car with less negative impact to you, and it would be easier to get into the new car. So getting out of a lease, it is possible. You can do it. You can trade in the car, make the remaining payments. There is also what we call a lease assumption. Now, a lease assumption is where someone assumes your lease, right? So let's say you have a lease, a car that you're leasing. You have a friend or a family member, an acquaintance, a coworker, someone that likes your car or wants to lease a car for the remaining term, right? So there are people out there that do that, and it makes sense to some people, not to everyone. You would have, if you were the person assuming the lease, you would have a shorter term, right? So you would assume the lease. Let's say you have a year left on the lease. You take that lease over for a year. If your payment is $300 and you take it over for a year, you spend $3,600 for the remaining year, right? There is no down payment because you already did the down payment, if you did a down payment, to originally get the car. So you're essentially only taking over remaining payments. Now, how do you do a lease assumption? So typically, whoever is going to assume the lease does have to have qualifying credit, right? Qualifying credit means different things for different banks or different manufacturers. So once you have this person that wants to take over the lease, you get in contact with your bank or the financial services department that is handling your lease. You say, hey, I have a friend, family, acquaintance, coworker, someone that would like to assume my lease. The bank, you, and that person work something out where that contract is now essentially transferred to that person completely, right? So you are free of all debt that is owed on that lease contract. That debt, that new debt, or that lease debt is then transferred over to the new contract for that other person. So you get out of that lease and you start fresh on the new one, right? So 3 ways to get out of a lease. There is the trade-in, that was number 1. Then there is the making of the remaining payments, that's number 2. And then number 3 would be getting the lease assumed, doing a lease assumption. So 3 ways to get out of a lease. Some easier than others. Some would make more sense for someone than others. So if you do have any questions about leasing, about trading in a car, about assuming a lease from someone, feel free to message me, contact me. There might be a link down below where you can check this video out, or a link to my website where you can submit an inquiry, questions. I will also have my phone number there where you can call me or text me directly at your convenience. Thanks again for tuning in to Did You Know with Driven.